The US dollar is about to collapse as countries around the world seek a safer alternative to the greenback. And this has many people wondering just how long the US dollar has left as the world reserve currency, especially as more nations are expressing interest in joining the BRICS nations in creating a digital and more independent currency. And with China's economy quickly growing and seemingly on track to exceed the size of the US's economy, there's clearly, for the first time in history, real risk for the US dollar losing its status. And the question is, just how long does the US have? How quickly can this happen? And how will it affect you if, in fact, the US dollar collapses? And that's exactly what I'm going to discuss in this video. But before I get into it, if you are seeking the truth about economics and finance, this is the place for you. So do me a favor. If at the end of this video you found it interesting, you found it insightful, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and I appreciate the support. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss the collapse of the US dollar. Now, fair warning here. If you're looking for a video that will support your worldview that the US dollar is about to collapse, well, this is probably not the video for you. So if you can't handle the truth with respect to what is happening here, go ahead, click off this video, and go watch something else that does actually support that worldview, because this isn't it. Okay, so now that we've got rid of all the people that are just here to see the US economy collapse, let's talk about what's actually happening here. Now, it makes complete sense that given all the news recently, you might expect that the US dollar is about to lose its status as the reserve currency. I mean, when you take a look at all the things that are happening, like inflation and the increase of the money supply and Saudi Arabia's apparent abandoning of the petrodollar, which, by the way, is fake news. I'll link to that video at the end. And the very clear and very real establishment of the BRICS nations, well, it seems that yes, there are some significant headwinds for the US dollar. However, none of this is new. This is all stuff that's happened before. In fact, the European Union and the euro was supposed to dethrone the US dollar and become the new reserve world currency. And well, we all know how that worked out. It just simply never happened. And if you look back in the history books, there are all kinds of articles going back in time that talk about the fact that the US dollar is about to collapse. I mean, just take a look at this one from The Economist in 2007, this one from the Foundation for Economic Education from 1995, and this one from Harvard Business Review that goes back to 1989. And there's no shortage of articles and research that suggests that the US is about to lose its status as the reserve currency. But it never seems to come to fruition. Now, I'm not saying that it won't happen at some point. In fact, it probably will. But the reality is that many people are starting to believe that this collapse is imminent. And it isn't. The primary reason why is that the global economy has a vested interest in making sure that a change in the reserve currency doesn't happen quickly. And I'll show you some data to support that a little bit later on when we talk about the sterling and the process of it losing its reserve currency status. But before I get into that, it's important to note that there is this concept. It's a scientific concept known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's clear that when it comes to the public's understanding of the US dollar, economic collapse, and even empire collapse, that there are many people that are suffering from this effect right now. And what the Dunning-Kruger effect suggests is that when somebody has limited knowledge in a topic, they tend to overestimate their expertise. So what ends up happening is you take somebody who watches a whole bunch of videos on YouTube, they find a limited amount of information to support their worldview, and then they believe that they've got the expertise and the understanding to know that whatever they believe, like the US dollar is going to collapse, is in fact true. And in university, when I was studying economics, many of my professors made it clear that most people do not ever leave the ignorant know-it-all stage and realize that there's more information that they need to learn about a topic before creating an opinion around it. So what often happens is people take in a limited amount of information, develop an opinion, and find themselves stuck at the know-it-all stage. And they never go on to realize that there's more to this than they realized and that they actually don't know enough about the topic to even have an informed opinion about it. But if they do get there and realize that there's more to know, they develop the ability to find the truth behind the information that is filtered through places like the news and YouTube and wherever else you're getting it from. And when it comes to economies and the US dollar and foreign currencies, I'm the first to say that this is a very complicated subject. And I'm also willing to acknowledge that my knowledge of it, even though I studied economics, is often limited. However, once you understand that there's so much that you don't know, you can start to develop tools to be able to figure out what is actually going on, or at least be able to debunk stories that are completely false or are maybe over sensationalized. And the primary skill set involved here is called critical thinking. It's the ability to analyze a subject and rip it apart. So that when somebody tells you something like Saudi Arabia just abandoned the petrodollar or the US dollar is about to collapse, you can take a look at the information and actually determine if it's true. And I'm going to tell you right now that there's a lot of information out there that suggests and supports that the US still has a significant amount of bandwidth left as the world reserve currency. To start, let's just look at the size of the US economy relative to other economies. Now, as you can see, the US economy is by far the biggest economy in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that China isn't catching up, because it is. However, when you look at the size of the Chinese and the United States economies relative to the rest of the economies in the world, they're both clearly the two world superpowers. In fact, the next two biggest economies, Germany and Japan, pale in comparison when compared to the US and the Chinese economy. So when you think about reserve currencies, you have to look at this and wonder, is the United States the biggest economy in the world because it has a reserve currency? Or is the reserve currency the US dollar because the United States has the biggest economy in the world? And all you have to do is look back to the end of World War II and the emergence of the United States economy from that period of time to realize that the US dollar became the reserve currency because of the size of the economy and because of the growth that was happening. Now, at some point, could China take over as the biggest economy in the world? Yes. But would that automatically make it a candidate to be the world reserve currency? And the answer is no. And that's largely to do with what is happening in the Chinese government and their policies with respect to investing within the country, which I'll get to a little bit later on. But in order to understand why the United States continues to be such a huge world superpower from an economic perspective, we have to look at the differences between varying countries and understand what makes the US so powerful from an economic perspective. And the good news here is that the Harvard Business Review has a great article on this exact topic. Now, an important thing to note here is that when you're looking for answers on any given topic, the sources that you look to matter. They need to be reputable, and they actually have to be sources that have a track record of having relevant data. And in this article from 2017, Martin S. Feldstein outlines 10 reasons why the US economy is so much bigger than every other economy, especially when you look at it from a per capita basis. Because the Chinese economy is still smaller than the US economy, but they have significantly more people, which should indicate that it should be significantly larger, but it's not. And the question is why? Well, there's multiple answers to that question. The first is that the US obviously has an entrepreneurial culture. They encourage their citizens to take risk and innovate. But that's just the beginning of the reasons why the US economy is so powerful. In addition to an entrepreneurial culture, they also have a financial system that supports entrepreneurship. So in other words, if an entrepreneur has a great idea, they have the access to funds to actually see it through to the finish and hopefully have it become a success. Look no further than companies like Apple, Microsoft, and even companies outside of the tech industry like Starbucks and McDonald's that have done very, very well, not just on a US scale, but on an international scale. On top of that, the US also has world-class research universities, which inspires innovation. And they also have labor markets that are unimpeded by large trade unions, state-owned enterprises, or excessively restrictive labor regulations, like most of the rest of the world, including Europe for that matter. In fact, in the United States, only 7% of the private sector labor force is actually unionized, which is one of the lowest rates in the world. Now, in addition to that, add a growing population, both from the perspective of birth rate and from immigration, which, by the way, is vital to an economy being successful. And just in these first 5 points, you've got a recipe for success that is clearly the reason why the US economy is so dominant. But it turns out there's even more. There's a cultural and a work system that encourages hard work and long hours. Now, not as hard of work as, say, in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, but still, from a worldwide perspective, the US is one of the hardest working countries in the world. And thanks to improvements in fracking technology, they also now have a supply of energy that makes North America energy independent. In fact, if you look to the north in Canada, there is more than an abundance of supply of oil and natural gas that could supply the US and North America pretty much into eternity. But here's where the real magic starts to happen. There's a favorable regulatory environment for small businesses, which means it is easier to start a business than it is in many other countries. There's a smaller government, which means less taxes. And there's a decentralized political system in which states compete. So instead of having one central government that rules the entire country, Individual states are allowed to make their own rules, which allows them to compete for innovation, entrepreneurship, and business revenues, which means that individual states all keep each other in check and creates more competitiveness. And if there's one word that you can use to describe the entire US economy, it's that it's based on competition. And competition creates innovation, innovation creates growth, and that is why the US economy is so massive. Now, that leads us to a conversation about the BRICS nations, because aside from China, the rest of the BRICS nations don't have any of this stuff in place, at least not to the same degree that the United States has it. So the question then becomes, what are the BRICS nations? Why does it exist? And what is the real risk here? In fact, most of the BRICS nations are so small in comparison to the United States and China that they essentially represent a rounding error when it comes to their ability to have economic power. The real driver behind the BRICS nations is the power of China, and the rest, other than the fact that they are well-known countries like Russia, are pretty much irrelevant. So if that's the case, then what's even the point of the BRICS nations organizing and creating this organization? And the simple answer to that is these countries have joined together, much like the European Union did, in the hopes that their growth can one day challenge the power of the United States from an economic perspective. However, it's important to note that any chance of them challenging the US is largely dependent on the success of China and not the other nations. Now, the irony here is that the BRICS nations were formalized in 2006, with South Africa joining in 2010. But the BRICS nations didn't actually even come up with the name BRICS. In fact, they weren't even the originator of the idea of the BRICS nations. No, the concept of the BRICS nations, believe it or not, was actually originated in the United States. Ironically, in 2001, Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs coined a paper building a better global economic BRICS. And what he was doing was he was identifying the emerging markets around the world that had the biggest chance of growth so that Goldman Sachs clients could invest in those economies in hopes of getting a higher return. And Jim O'Neill has recently stated that the success of these nations is beyond what he ever expected. But that doesn't change the fact that aside from China, the rest of these nations are still emerging nations. They're in no way global superpowers. In fact, if you break out the BRICS nations using that data I showed earlier, showing the biggest economies in the world, what you will notice is that aside from China, these are all still very small economies, and the size of the BRICS nations combined, when you include Saudi Arabia, who isn't even an official member yet and may never actually become an official member, the size of the BRICS nations combined, if you take out Saudi Arabia, aren't even the size of the United States economy. And if you do add in Saudi Arabia, they're just slightly bigger. Then, if you add in all the economic allies of the United States, countries like Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Canada, Mexico, Australia, South Korea, Spain, Netherlands, Indonesia, and Switzerland, you can see that the dominance of the US dollar and the dominance of the US economy combined with all of its allies more than doubles the size of the BRICS nations. And unless something crazy happens like Germany or Japan or the United Kingdom or France joins BRICS, which is probably not going to happen, the chances of the BRICS nations outpacing the size of the US economy and its allies are very much slim to none, at least not in my lifetime. And any additional countries that aren't named on this chart are essentially, like I said earlier, a rounding error. They would make no significant difference whatsoever. So then the question becomes, if China is spearheading this whole thing, what are China's actual interests when it comes to challenging the US dollar and creating a central currency among the BRICS nations? Well, in order to understand that, we need to look at China's broader interests. And they are clearly that they want to have the ability to trade with sanctioned nations. They don't want their ability to trade with countries like Russia to cease because the US says, hey, you can't trade with Russia anymore. And that's largely the reason why an independent currency is gaining so much steam right now. It's the plan B just in case China or one of its trading partners gets into a conflict with the US that allows them to continue to trade. And you have to understand that China's economy is largely an export-driven economy. So they don't want another country like the US dictating who they can trade to because they have to use that currency. So essentially, what China is trying to do is create an independent currency that creates checks and balances for the US dollar. And I think China understands that there is very little chance that the alternative currency, that by the way hasn't even been created yet, isn't going to be a dominant force when it comes to taking over from the US dollar. Now, I know what you might be thinking, and that's that China's the biggest exporter in the world, so why don't they just force other countries to buy in their currency? Well, there's good reasons why that won't work, and I'll get to that in a second. And the primary reason that it won't work is because of China's protective nature when it comes to investing in China. In fact, China has what's called the negative list of market access. And this list is designed to prevent foreign entities from investing in certain things within their country. And when you look at the things that are listed, things like agriculture, forestry, animal husbandry and fishery, mining, manufacturing, production and supply of electric power, heat, gas, and water, construction, wholesale and retail, transportation, the list goes on and on. What you can clearly see here is that pretty much anything that another country would be interested in investing in is off limits. So even though China could, in theory, say, if you want our goods, you're going to have to pay in our currency, the reality is most countries aren't going to want to do that because if they begin trading in the Chinese currency, the only use of that currency is to buy stuff from China, which means if they find themselves in a position where they have excess funds, there's pretty much nothing that they can do with that money, which is why the US dollar for most countries is a significantly better alternative because if there is an excess amount of US cash in a country's central reserves, they can invest it in the US economy freely and not have to worry about it just sitting there and losing value. Now, in addition to that, there's also the matter of China's biggest trading partners and who they export to. And what you can see from this chart is that the United States is by far the biggest consumer of Chinese goods, which means that China probably doesn't want to lose their relationship with the United States by forcing them to have to use the Chinese currency. Because if they were to force the hand of the United States would simply invest in other countries to create manufacturing abilities that are comparable to those found in China. They might move their manufacturing to Mexico like they had once done, or to other countries around the world, which means the revenue sources that drive the Chinese economy, which is exports and primarily manufacturing, could pretty much disappear overnight if they were to not play nice with the US. So while China definitely has ambitions for their currency to be the world reserve currency, they're also well aware of the fact that they can't play their cards too soon without putting their own economy at significant risk. Now, in addition to that, if you just take a look at this chart and you look at all of China's trading partners, what you'll begin to realize is that more than half of all Chinese exports actually end up going to US allied countries. So even though China might want to say, hey, we're the biggest exporter in the world, you have to use our currency, more than half the countries in the world are already using the US dollar and have significant reserves of it that are going to be used to buy those goods. Now, in the same vein, the US also has a vested interest in not picking an economic fight with China, because much like the US is the biggest consumer of Chinese goods, China is also the biggest supplier of US imports. So even though China is leading the BRICS nations, both countries, the US and China, have a vested interest in making sure that their economic ties remain tied. But it's also clear that China is in a slightly weaker position here because when you look at the countries around the world that import the most goods, aside from India, almost all of them are US dollar friendly countries. So China at this point simply does not have the leverage it needs to force a new world reserve currency. They definitely have the leverage they need to create an alternative, but that alternative is simply not going to have legs, at least not for the time being. And as we go through and analyze and rip the whole idea of the US dollar collapsing apart, there's further evidence to support this point when you look at the largest countries or regions by total international trade, and you look down the list and see that there's simply not a lot of countries in the BRICS nations that are on this list or that have significant world trade. It becomes clear that the BRICS nations simply do not have the international trade ability to support the Chinese economy, which means China needs the rest of the world in the same way that the rest of the world needs China to provide its goods. And then when you take a look at the allocation of reserve currencies, it turns out that the US dollar isn't the only reserve currency. In fact, there are multiple reserve currencies. The US dollar is by far the biggest, with 54% of all reserve currencies being held in US dollars. Then there's the euro in second. And if you look at the Chinese renminbi, well, what you will see is that it is a small sliver relative to the euro and the US dollar. And this creates a pretty significant economic headwind for China to create an alternative digital currency to the US dollar for trade. Doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. But the lack of use of Chinese currency is definitely a headwind when it comes to creating a new currency to be traded in that's outside of the US dollar. Now, I hope that makes it clear that the US dollar is not at significant risk, at least at the moment. But the question is, how much time does the US dollar have if collapse is actually imminent? And if the US dollar was to collapse and be ousted as the world currency, how long would it take before the transition actually happened? Well, there's some data from the not so recent past that indicates exactly how long that would take. And the most relevant data is actually from the most recent transition from the British sterling to the US dollar that started in 1945. But what's interesting about that transition was that the sterling's reserve role was prolonged until the late 1970s by the structure of international monetary system and collective global interest in its continuation, so that the retirement of the sterling as a reserve currency was achieved through negotiated management among the developed and developing world. And to put this simply, what that meant is that the global economy, all the countries, all the developing nations and the developed nations had a vested interest in making sure that the transition from the sterling to the US dollar did not happen too quickly. Because if it had happened too quickly, it would have left many countries that held the British sterling basically holding a currency which would have rendered most countries' reserves essentially worthless. So it wasn't just in Britain's best interest for that transition to happen slowly. It was in the best interest of all countries for that transition to happen slowly. And if there is, in fact, a transition from the US dollar to some other currency, it is in the best interest of all nations for that transition not to happen too quickly and not to bankrupt all the countries because the US dollar goes from here to here in value very, very quickly. And by the way, this is especially true for countries like China, who are one of the biggest holders of US dollars on the planet. So China, just like every other nation, in fact, to a greater extent, has a vested interest in seeing that the US dollar does not collapse. Because if it does, all of the reserves that they hold, and therefore a significant portion of the wealth that the country has, is pretty much rendered worthless, which would obviously create an economic catastrophe. So even though China has expressed interest in seeing an alternative reserve currency, they've got a vested interest in making sure that it doesn't happen too quickly. Now, all that being said, there are some arguments for an independent reserve currency, and this has been brought up over the years on many, many occasions by many different countries. And the arguments for an independent reserve currency make sense. But this is not a new idea. In fact, this very idea was suggested prior to the Bretton Woods Agreement when the world transitioned to the US dollar. And not only that, there's already an independent reserve currency. The IMF maintains a basket of currencies, 5 currencies, that are used when certain currencies start to struggle. So in 2008, when the US dollar declined significantly, the IMF in many cases stepped in and used their basket of reserve currencies to support worldwide trade. And quite honestly, this concept makes sense. And it also makes sense for the BRICS nations to have their own digital currencies so that they can trade and not have to worry about trading in each other's currencies, which can be wildly overvalued or undervalued at any given time. An independent reserve currency could also eliminate currency risk and conversion costs in international trade. So instead of having to convert a dollar to a euro or any other currency, you just have a currency that every single currency converts to, and it becomes the global hub. This idea makes a ton of sense as well. But most importantly, and what you need to understand about the BRICS nations, is that they aren't necessarily trying to take out the US dollar. What they're trying to do is create a currency that can be used, which prevents the US from conducting economic warfare by sanctioning countries like Russia when they do things that the US doesn't like. So really what this is all about is it's about creating an alternative. It's not about dethroning the dollar, and they definitely don't want to do it quickly because if they did, they would feel just as much economic pain as the US would. And there's definitely no doubt that an independent reserve currency would free up trade, make more trade possible, and globally would end up being a good thing. But that doesn't mean that it's going to supersede the US dollar. It may just be simply something that is aligned with the US dollar, especially when you consider that most countries are probably going to want to continue to invest their money in the United States over China, just given the fact that it's still a bigger economy and it is a substantially more stable economy for a foreigner to invest in. So then the question becomes, what should you do? If you're worried about the US dollar collapse, you shouldn't be. It's not something that, regardless of all the articles out there and all the stories out there, is of imminent concern. It wasn't in the 1980s, wasn't in the 1990s, wasn't in the 2000s, and it definitely isn't today. It's definitely something to be aware of, but it's not something that you should be basing your financial decisions on. Instead, what you should be doing is focusing on what you can control. Things like increasing your income, paying down your debt, and purchasing hard assets that can generate income. Things like real estate, for example, or tools of your trade that can be used to produce income if the worst actually happens. And once you've been able to increase your income and pay off your debt, then it becomes important to invest wisely. The S&P 500 is still the best place to park your money, but if you want a little bit of diversification and you want to invest in those BRICS nations because they are emerging markets and they are growing, then maybe it makes sense to diversify your portfolio a little bit and find an ETF that invests in those countries. But if you do this, just keep in mind that the US is still by far the best place in the world to invest, and it would make the most sense to have the majority of your holdings at home in the US. So if you are going to invest in the BRICS nations, make it a small part of your portfolio, but don't YOLO and put all of your money into emerging markets, because you have to remember they are emerging markets and they are significantly more vulnerable economies than what the US is. Oh, and at the beginning of this video, I mentioned the stories about the US and the Saudi Arabia petrodollar agreement expiring, which, by the way, is fake news. If you want to see more about that and you want the truth, make sure you check out this video right here.